Now let's focus on the neck, which compared to the other features we've sculpted so far is a much more broad feature. But thankfully, the simplified geometric version that we sculpted initially and then smoothed out actually gets us about 75% the way to a finished neck. I want to take it the rest of the 25% by adding key features based on the anatomy. So let's take a look at these features in our anatomic model first. I'm going to turn on my skin labels. And if I remember the count, it's about 7 distinct features that we want to implement. And the first one that my eyes go to is the jugular notch. This is one of the most defined parts. It's a very deep divot at the base of the anterior triangle, also the Adam's apple. But off of the jugular notch is the sternal head of the sternocleidomastoid. This is also a very prominent feature on most necks. Then we've got the clavicular head of the same muscle, the sternocleidomastoid. And this is often visible, but less prominent than the sternal head. All right, so that's 4 features. And then around the back, we've got the spinous process, which is where the bumps of the spine start to appear. And that comes out at the base of the ligamentum nuchae, which produces a subtle channel or central crevice down the back of the neck. And then up at the base of the skull is the external occipital protuberance. This is that bump on the back of your head that you can feel. And that is the 7 features primarily. Also, we're going to sculpt the collarbone, which is not as prominent in this anatomical model. But those are the main features that will serve to refine the shape that's already, again, about 70% there. So let's begin the same way we looked at the anatomical model. And that is the jugular notch down here at the base of the anterior triangle. So I'm going to use my inflate brush, set the strength lower than 1, maybe like 0.6. And I'm going to focus a V shape starting subtle by holding control and then increasing my pressure towards the base. Okay, and then eventually we will dig out a substantial divot from the bottom. That might be a little too much. Although it does depend on the person. Some people have very, very deep jugular notches. And then out of that shape, we'll go ahead and sculpt a thin sternal head of the sternocleidomastoid with the inflate brush. Keep it pretty thin, subtle strokes, but just building up a straight line along the jugular notch. All right, make sure to smooth out the top pretty significantly. And then while we're at it, we'll continue laterally and sculpt another more subtle divot, kind of a right side up triangle. Whereas this one was kind of upside down, we're going to sculpt it right side up, just subtly pushing inward. All right, so once we have done that, maybe make it a little more prominent at the base along the collarbone. Smooth all of that out. And what this triangle gives us is the clavicular head of the sternocleidomastoid. Now, if you sculpt this too prominent, right, if I left it like this, you only see this kind of definition if the body is under some sort of exertion, right? So if you're, pulling your corners of your cheek backward, you'll see your neck really tighten. Or if you're lifting something heavy, something that the body is exerting a lot of force, you'll see this kind of definition. Otherwise, you won't. So for a neutral pose, you definitely do not want this much definition. I'm going to pull it back also. I think it's a little too far out. And then smooth this back significantly, holding shift, making sure that that is nice and subtle. And on some people, this hardly appears at all. Certainly by comparison to the sternal head. Sometimes this is so thin and prominent, it can look like this. It's almost like nails on a chalkboard for me. Maybe because it's like a pressure point. I don't know why, but when it's too thin, it kind of makes me feel weird inside. So I don't usually like to leave it this thin. Going to undo those strokes, even though you can see in photographs that people do have that kind of definition. Now, beside the base of the sternal head, I'm going to make a little, whoops, wrong brush. I'm going to use my inflate brush. We're going to bulk this out a little bit and create a knob. All right, so this knob is part of the collarbone or the clavicle. All right, and on some people, the knob is very prominent before it kind of lengthens into a long tube. All right, so I'm going to use my inflate brush and just kind of follow the silhouette. All right, so we have from the front a definitive shadow, right? Maybe even I need to go more. So with the inflate brush, I'm going to hold Control and push down on the inside edge of the clavicle. There we go. That's more like it. And on some people, this knob is very prominent. Others, it's not so prominent. But generally, this is the kind of shape that we're after. Now, in terms of the shape of the clavicle, it's usually not straight across. I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, sometimes it is, but more often you'll see it start higher from the shoulder and then swoop down, more like this. I'm going to smooth out on that inside edge into the trapezius muscle because my inflate stroke left an unsightly ridge, but that's pretty good. Understand that the bottom of the clavicle is going to look weird because we've cut off the rest of the body. So I'm trying not to be too concerned about that, and you shouldn't either, because ultimately with this portrait, we're going to add the illusion of the rest of the body by adding some clothes and cutting off the render frame before we get to the bottom of the sculpture here. But that is looking pretty good in terms of collarbone and base of the neck. Now, if we move upward, we can add the Adam's apple, and this is kind of a curved V shape. I'm going to once again use my inflate brush, and I'm looking at kind of the 3/4 height of this central column. And I'm just going to make this shape like a V, kind of push it out most in the center. And then usually I like to touch a little bit at the top as well, and then smooth this shape out. All right, that's a common theme you'll see on a lot of these features of the neck. Sculpt the shape too strong and then smooth it back to be more believable. And that's actually pretty good for the Adam's apple. Some people, once again, have a very prominent point at the tip of the Adam's apple. And it's another one of those things that's like, ugh, that could cut glass almost. But I'm going to keep it more subtle. Some people also hardly show an Adam's apple. Females don't usually show the Adam's apple, but even on males, sometimes it's extremely subtle. But I think that's pretty good. And then most of the time, I like to sculpt a more subtle version of that shape below. Make sure I have my inflate brush, and kind of in the center of that remaining column, I'll just sculpt a subtle V shape. There we go. Especially on a male, you get that secondary V shape of the trachea. That looks pretty good. But it's very subtle, right? Other than the jugular notch and sternal head of the sternocleidomastoid, everything else is more subtle than it is obvious. And this took me a long time to figure out. There's a bit of an art to it. Now, sometimes I will come in here to the crease of the neck between the jaw and the top of the neck and kind of tighten this crease. Maybe even inflate if there needs to be, more bulk. But again, it's one of those things that some people have and some people don't. But usually it's something that I will try. Now, below the ear, I'm going to lean on my knowledge of the anatomy to go ahead and cut a subtle crease down. All right, so this emphasizes the shape of the sternocleidomastoid, and then I will smooth it out significantly. Right, but just adding that subtle shape reinforces the anatomy, makes it feel a lot more believable. So that's something that I like to lean on when sculpting anything organic, but especially the neck here. Because with everything being so subtle, it was easy for me to make the decision to not do anything. It wasn't until I started to understand the anatomy better that I could achieve those subtle shapes. And hopefully you're starting to understand that throughout the course of this lesson as well. Now, on the side of the neck, some people have another definition similar to the sternocleidomastoid heads. All right, so if we switch back over to our anatomical model, and I have the skin, the neck is comprised of several tube-like muscles that are all tightly packed and interwoven together. The most prominent one in the external neck shape is the sternocleidomastoid, but there's also a few on the side, sometimes that like to protrude externally, especially when the neck is under exertion. But sometimes you'll see the posterior scalene poke out a little bit. So I will add that, add a tiny bit of definition, right? So with my inflate brush, just subtly adding this kind of structure, smoothing it out a lot. And this will break up that monotonous shape. And that just feels a lot more organic to me. It's these subtle little touches that I think goes a long way. And that's going to do it for the front and side. Oh, well, now that I'm talking about that, the one more little thing that I like to do, again, this is in the same ballpark of not being visible on everybody, but if we look back at the anatomical model, the trapezius hooks around and connects to the clavicle. And so I like to imply that by cutting a subtle stroke down with my draw sharp and then smooth that out a whole lot. All right, I mean, just barely add those features in. So making sure I smooth that out. It's these tiny little features that go a long way for me. All right, you see those subtle changes in the shading? That feels much more organic, much more finished to me. But now we'll move around to the back side. And I actually didn't continue that shape, the trapezius ridge, enough. I like to start at the base of the skull and then go down, but I forgot to do that initially. So I'm going to add that. And what that does from the back is creates this important crisscross of angles. All right, so on the side, the silhouette comes straight down, and then the trapezius creates subtle shading that crisscrosses. And those two angles, I always try to include in the necks of my sculptures. And now we'll create that central crevice that comes from the ligamentum nuchae. I'll grab my crease brush with Shift C, and right down the center, we're going to push inward. Let me see, I think my fall off for some reason is smooth. I want it to be sharp. And some people, it's as subtle as this, but I'm gonna go a little bit further. And then we can smooth out something like this. But these two columns are very important, especially for a more toned neck. And then once we cut straight down, we'll then cut a diamond shape below that. We'll go out and then back down. Okay, so this needs to be very subtle. This is a shape that can get out of hand quickly. All right, that's the beginning of the spinous process. Now on the back, I don't like how the edge of my sculpture rounds over so much, so I'm going to tighten that into a sharper edge. Then pinch it up. Without it being sharp, I think the anatomy gets really muddy around there. So that actually looks pretty good. All right, after I cut the crease, I like to inflate on that interior side. And what that inflate inward will do is leave a little knob for the spine. Right, those little bumps on the spine that you see going down. And again, this stuff is very subtle on the backside, which can feel weird with such a underdefined large section below the neck. But more often than not, it's less defined than it is defined. So I guess I'm giving you the warning. Sometimes I overdo this area. I commonly overdo this area, and it ends up being like a visual splinter. You just know something's wrong with it, but you don't quite know why. And that's, I've found over time, to be over definition rather than under defining. But if you follow the crease down and then light diamond shape, you should be pretty good. All right, so that I think is good for the back of the neck. Now up into the base of the skull, we're going to cut the external occipital protuberance, and I'm in back orthographic view. I'm going to grab my crease brush, and I'm going to start this stroke even with the top of the ear. And this shape is going to look something like this. Again, I'm keeping it very subtle, a broad brush size. And then on the corners, I'm going to lightly touch individually and push those in a little bit further. And finally at the base. Okay, it's pushing in these corners and then smoothing everything out. That's going to produce the subtle protuberance that I want, right? And I can't overemphasize how important those extra pokes on the corners are. Okay, the worst thing for this kind of shape is for it to be too even. Something like this looks nothing like the back of the head, but keep it very subtle with varying depths, and that's what the extra pokes on the corners do. And you should have a much more organic feeling surface. Now, some people have a very, just like the Adam's apple, a very strong, obvious protuberance like this. I'm going to keep it more subtle. And then finally, similar to the neck, I like to make a similar shape at the base of the skull. So with my draw sharp, actually my crease brush, Shift C, it's going to be just more of a V shape to connect into the ligamentum nuchae and smooth this one out. It needs to be a more subtle shape. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit too defined. Whoops. Use my grab brush to kind of pull this back. Let's look at the side view. Yeah, the protuberance needs to come out to more of a point, and in general, that volume needs to come out. Maybe a little bit up as well. Anyway, this kind of brings up the fact that I think there's a lot to fill in between all the features that we've compartmentalized, and we're going to do that in the next video. But for this one, I feel pretty good about this being a refined neck structure.